Welcome to WonderPod. WonderPod is the official podcast of WonderFest, Ireland's first online children's book festival. I'm your host, Conor Bredin. In this podcast, we'll be discussing everything there is to talk about with children's books. I'll be talking with Ireland's top writers, illustrators, publishers, agents, and more. You can find out more about WonderFest by heading to wonderfest.ie. Now, on with the show. Hello there, all you wonderful people. See what I did there? And welcome to the first ever episode of WonderPod, the official podcast of WonderFest, Ireland's first online children's book festival. If you haven't listened to the trailer episode, this podcast is all for the aspiring children's authors and illustrators out there. But there's plenty, don't worry, there's plenty for the already published authors and illustrators. Over the next 8 weeks, I, Conor Bredin, will be interviewing authors, illustrators, agents, publishers, and more. I'll also be talking to the creative team that founded WonderFest. As for me, as I said, my name is Conor Bredin. I am a primary school teacher, a podcaster, and, which this is the reason I'm doing this show, I'm an aspiring children's author. So, today's episode. Today is all about writing non-fiction books, and to discuss that, I'll be speaking with Oisín McGann. Oisín is the author of books such as Race the Atlantic Wind, Kings of the Realm, and many more. He's also an illustrator and the artistic mind behind the pictures you see in the Accidental Adventures of Onion O'Brien series, as well as many, many more. Oisín's latest book is called The Short, Hopeful Guide to Climate Change. It's a story about our civilization and our environment, wildfires, glaciers, war, and wilderness. Oisín talks all about how he got started in children's books, what inspired him to get into non-fiction after being in fiction for so long, and the importance of engagement when it comes to writing non-fiction. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling, on with the interview. Hello, Oisín, and welcome to WonderPod. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you very much.
Good. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and not only coming on the show, but being the person who decided, I'll do the first episode, the one where he doesn't know what he's doing and what's going on.
I'm sure we'll do fine.
I hope so. We're both able to talk and listen, and that's all a podcast really needs. Just may as well start with the very beginning. How did you yourself get involved in children's literature in general? Because you're an author and an illustrator. So how did you get started?
Well, I think it was always part of the plan. When I was in school, I'd been writing stories all my life, and when I got to secondary school, I started taking them a bit more seriously, but I also didn't know how you got into it. Excuse me, sorry. And I was kind of big into comics at the time, so I started kind of focusing more on comics and both writing and drawing. And I think up until that point, I thought I dreamed of doing it, but I didn't know how you got into it. So I was thinking you had to have a proper job. So kind of the first half of secondary school, I wanted to be a zoologist because I thought, well, at least that's a science, that's a job you can imagine kind of working in somehow. Although I think I was kind of thinking more along the lines of kind of the Indiana Jones of science. I thought I was going to be running through jungles and kind of being chased by elephants and that kind of stuff. So on one hand, I was kind of hit with the reality of what zoology actually was going to be. You're more likely going to be spending a lot of time studying stuff at the side of the canal or kind of, much more mundane stuff. And at the same time, I was still writing my stories. Now, I probably wasn't writing as much as I had been in kind of the upper end of primary school. I did the art exam in the intercert. You probably won't remember the intercert. The intercert was what the junior cert now is. And back then, I hadn't done any classes in school in art, but back then you could just do drawing and painting and not any, in the exams, there wasn't any kind of academic side to the exams. So I went in and I did the exam, and I enjoyed it. Like, who enjoys their inter? So I came out thinking, well, actually, maybe this is a message. It's a sign I need to kind of be doing what I want to do, and what I wanted to do was comics. So I went to art college. And again, wasn't quite doing what I wanted to do or learning what I wanted. And I ended up dropping out of art college and trying to get into comics and didn't make it. I applied to 2008 a couple of times. And then I worked in London for a while in advertising design, and eventually wrote my first book. I'd kind of always had in my head that I was going to write a book, but it just kept kind of not happening. And eventually I said, if I'm going to get published, I really need to write a book. So I wrote my first novel and started pitching it to agents. And I was turned down a bunch of times with the second draft, I think. And really was kind of, I'd worked enough in illustration that I was used to taking the answer no, and kind of, that's fine. We'll try another thing. So, and eventually moved back to Ireland, and I was still pitching the book to UK publishers, but I went to the O'Brien Press for looking for illustration work, and they liked a couple of styles I did, but they didn't have stories to suit the style. So they said, look, we'll give you a call when we have something. We have this series we want people to write for, but we don't actually have anybody writing for that at the moment. And I said, well, give us tell me what you want. I write stuff, so give me a shot at it. And that's where the first two Matt Grandad books came from. And having written those, they said, have you tried writing anything longer? And I said, well, funny you should ask. And at this point, I had my second novel written as well. So I pitched them two novels, and they took the first two Matt Grandad books, and optioned a third novel as well. So, and that was it. I was off then. I kind of, had 5 books come out in the space of 2 years actually.
Wow.
So it's a weird business though. It's kind of, you kind of really important that you land on the right desk at the right time. But the illustration, I'd been working as an illustrator in publishing for years, so I understood publishing fairly well. I knew that persistence was going to count. I also knew there wasn't a huge amount of money in Irish publishing. I was used to dealing with editors, and I was used to being involved in that side of the business. So once I got going, I knew what other things to try. It's just kind of gone from there, really.
So that's really interesting, though, that, it's you said there is an element of luck, and you have to land, like I said, you have to land on the right desk at the right time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But I think a lot of people on my side of the fence, people who are aspiring to be in this field, place too much emphasis on the luck and not enough on but you have to keep trying. You have to, like, when you have one novel written, don't just keep submitting it and hope for the best. Write another one while you're waiting. No,
I think there's, in fact, the environment's probably changed even since I got started, because there's an awful lot more information available, and advice and support available for people starting off. And you also have the situation where, for the publishers, they have, it's oversupply. They have more books than they need being pitched, far more books than they need being pitched at them. So they can give people a first try a lot. But I think in some ways it's harder to start a career and then maintain it. But on the other hand, I find that people coming into this for the first time are better prepared than I would have been. Certainly people who haven't worked in publishing coming in for the first time, just in terms of particularly in children's books, because children's books are so kind of, we have events and other stuff tied in with what we do. So on that hand, there are advantages now in that people kind of have a better idea of what's involved. But also it can be more intimidating, because you know how many other people are kind of going for it, and you have a better idea of what your chances are. So that can kind of be intimidating. Whereas before we had all this stuff online, it was a case of, I really don't know how many pitches a publisher gets a year, so surely I have an okay chance at it, So sometimes I think too much information is a bad thing. Maybe it can put people off. But persistence, it really does count, and luck is always going to be an element. And even no matter what contacts you have, you might be able to get yourself higher up the pile in terms of when your stuff will be looked at. But
your stuff still needs to be good, no matter if you're first on the list or 100th.
And in fact, publishers now expect things to be more finished. I think there's probably not as much emphasis on editing, and they're being pitched stuff because people are better prepared. They're kind of spoiled for choice, really. Because people are coming in and they understand more about storytelling, they understand more about what's involved and how to pitch. And now, right, publishers are expecting a more finished product. It's kind of, it sometimes feels like they hold all the cards, but then of course they always need new people. They will always need new blood. So that's just kind of an element of it.
So let's just talk a little bit more now, more niche and more focused. I asked you to come onto the show to talk specifically about the genre of creative nonfiction books, which I'll be honest, before I really started getting involved in children's fiction and getting involved in WonderFest, I just thought books were fiction, nonfiction. And then there's creative nonfiction, which sounds very conflicting, because to someone who isn't in the know, it sounds like, well, how can you be creative within nonfiction? So maybe could you explain what you think creative nonfiction is?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a phrase I use very much. I'm the same. I kind of think, fiction and nonfiction. I think creative nonfiction would tend to imply that what you're saying is true, it hasn't been made up, but you're telling it in a kind of, you're using a storytelling form, and that's kind of it's a narrow line to walk. So, for instance, my last book was Race the Atlantic Wind, and that was about a real event. It was about the first attempt to fly across the Atlantic. And it is a fiction book. It's a story written as a novel. But pretty much everything, as much as possible, all the facts in it are true. But you could never call it a nonfiction book because you're making it up and because you're telling a story minute by minute. You're having to make up stuff that nobody could know, because you're having to tell things as they happened, and that's just, we have no idea. We can tell the facts of the story, but we can't tell, for instance, you might have to describe the carpet of a place you walk into, or you might have to describe how a plane sounded at a certain time. So there's so much detail and stuff that you have to make up, that you can't call that book a non-fiction book, even though it's very much based on true events. So I think that's the line we cross, is where you're using fictional tools to tell a non-fiction, or to deliver a kind of non-fiction, and so I'm talking about A Short Hopeful Guide to Climate Change, and that was, I wanted it to have a narrative arc, so that it's not just because a lot of the books that are out there about this stuff are kind of, they're laid out like science books, they're kind of, here's a diagram, here's your bit of text, here's your description for the next section, and they don't kind of weave together particularly, or they don't have a momentum, so that they're carrying you through. And I think that's what I would consider creative nonfiction, is where you are using storytelling techniques to convey facts. I mean, I was trying to think of, you wanted to you're asking kind of for an example. So
I did one in my head from my own childhood, that I only thought of it as you're explaining it there, and especially considering your own background in comic strips and everything. When I was a young kid, the Horrible Histories series by Terry Deary first kind of came to light, and they're very much nonfiction. They're very much history, but there's comic strips in them, and there's funny stories, and there's quizzes, and there's everything. And there are a lot less of that, what you're explaining, here's the definition, here's the diagram, here's the label.
And I think that probably, I mean, that's a really good example, because what you're doing is you're putting an awful lot of effort into engagement, into getting the person's attention before you do anything else. And I think that's a really important aspect to, I mean, it's important in education. Every teacher will know, the important, you could have 30 heads in the class, 30 minds in the class, but they're not all going to be switched on at the same time. And you can only hope for the best. Like when you start explaining something, you can explain something really clearly, but if they're not switched on, they could be just, either they're not interested, or their heads in the clouds, or so your first job is actually to engage before you do any teaching or before you do any explaining. And we don't put a lot of emphasis, I think, on that. I also think for me, there's two elements to communication. One is to explain clearly, and one is to engage, to hold a person's attention. And the arts basically are there. That's what they're for. They're to get our attention, to hold our attention, get us emotionally involved. And I think too often they're regarded just as entertainment, or pastime, and therefore they're not given the priority that they need to be given. And I think in some ways the pandemic's kind of helped undo that a little bit, because we've started to realize, well, actually there's, there are really important scientific facts people need to know. How do we get them paying attention? And also, what are we going to spend our time, how are we going to spend our time explaining stuff, and, dealing with all this extra time we have, and keeping our mental health intact and all that kind of stuff. So, so this whole idea of engagement, I think it's coming around, and climate change is a really good example of where this has failed a lot of the time, because there's an awful lot, people who are an expert or have a background in something will often assume that they only have to say something clearly for it to be communicated. When in fact we've learned, it's simply not the case. You could say this things over and over and over again, but if people aren't emotionally involved and not engaged, it just doesn't go in, or it doesn't have an impact. I think now science communication is getting a lot better, and I think that's kind of being taken more seriously now. The idea that you have to put more effort into just getting people's attention before you start trying to teach them or explain anything.
Well, it's like the old phrase that I've heard from the educator side of my life, that I might, it's supposed to be a phrase, I can't remember the exact wording, so I know I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to do my best. It's something along the lines of, I won't remember what you taught me, but I will remember how you made me feel. Yeah. And that's kind of what you're saying with the engagement, right? It's you have to get people to be passionate, and you have to get people to care, especially when it's a topic as important as climate change. And then hopefully they'll remember feeling that, and then the facts will kind of come along with it. Yeah.
So, and that's, what got me into this whole topic in the first place, or got me in terms of, applying my work to it, was I was doing school residencies, teaching creative writing for Poetry Ireland. We're kind of organising these residencies, and they have what are called development education residencies. So they take on a theme that we go in and teach creative writing for. So we started off with child labour, and then we worked on, we did fair trade for a bit, but that was very hard to do, very hard to make stories out of, and we did hunger. So we started off, and the idea was that we were basically trying to provoke empathy. So rather than trying to explain an issue just by delivering the facts, we were getting people to write a story about somebody in a particular situation.
Yeah.
And that way they're kind of thinking, they're thinking in detail about how this might be, how it might affect people, or and I always made a point of these stories had to be set in Ireland, no matter what issue we were dealing with. You couldn't write about some other place, particularly, one you didn't know, you couldn't kind of write convincingly about. So they had to write about that situation in their own, environment. And I ended up doing this residency, a climate change residency, in 2014, and that was real education. We do a bit of traveling, actually, which is kind of ironic, seeing as we were supposed to be kind of learning about how not to affect the climate.
Yeah.
But so it was an international residency, 5 different countries: Ireland, Germany, UK, Poland, and Australia. And we basically had to go off and learn about climate change, and then figure out different ways of conveying that information. And there were schools involved in that as well. So I started dealing with 3 different secondary schools. And my attitude was always, I have to engage first. That's my job. I'm not an expert on these topics, but I do know about storytelling. So I always regard it as it's kind of 80% engagement, 20% facts. If I can get them to soak in the facts that I do give them, and the stuff that they can use for stories, then that's my job done. What I want is that when they hear about something, say climate change, on the radio, that they turn their head and listen, because it has become relevant to them.
Yeah.
And if I manage to do that, that's my job, done. So we need more of that. So I think that's where creative nonfiction comes in, or even writing stories with a particular theme. I mean, people say you should never write with an agenda, but I think that everybody writes with a bloody agenda. That's what writing is.
Yeah.
The thing is to make it a good enough story that you don't feel like you're having an agenda delivered, just dropped into your lap.
Yeah.
It's usually a good story.
It's like all writing should entertain first and hopefully educate second.
Well, if I'm not getting your attention, then I'm not doing my job. I mean, that's,
exactly. Yeah.
If I have to get you past page 2, all right, past page 1 onto page 2. That's my job. I mean, nonfiction can be straightforward for instance, for an academic thing where you're already interested in the subject and you just need the information delivered clearly, right? And I think sometimes in academic circles, because that's the way you do it, if you're in academia, you deliver stuff. You've got an audience who are already interested, engaged, because they want to be there, right? So that's the way you think about communication. And I think when you're dealing with an audience who have no interest in your subject and don't have your background and expertise and your areas of interest, and then you're trying to convey your subject, simply explaining it isn't enough. You have to give us a reason to care about it. And I think that's where you get writers who write in an emotionally engaging way about really important subjects. And I think they can be really powerful books. So I was trying to think of a good example of this. There's a book by Philip Hoare called Leviathan, or The Whale. And he writes about whales. He loves whales. He just wrote a book, and it's a nonfiction book, but it's very much how he thinks about them and his experience of going to different places and being in the water with whales. And there was stuff in that really struck me as being, why I've been interested in whales for years and I don't know some of this stuff. So simple things like being in the water when a whale uses its sonic pulses and you can feel them. So if you're in the whale, if you were in the water when a sperm whale used its kind of these sonic pulses full force, it would hurt. Like you could be deafened by it. It's one of the loudest sounds in the world. And he was making the point that when a whale uses these to look at you or to look at any other living creature, it's not seeing a surface image, it's seeing all the way through. So it's like the ultrasound of looking at a fetus in the womb. So it looks through the bodies of things and it sees the whole body. It doesn't just see the surface. And this is a very profound thing. I'd never really thought of that before, because of course I knew it in my head that that's what they did, but I hadn't thought of it in those terms. So when somebody makes something like clear and all of a sudden you're engaged in a different way, this is more than just an interesting fact. That's, so that I was thinking, well, think about how you would look at living beings if that's the way you could see them. So they can only guess at how sensitive these things are, but they think, for instance, they might know if they're ill, just by using these sonic pulses. They might be able to tell if their emotions by just being able to look. And of course, and it also changed the way you look at the world. So when they were, the massive sonar arrays that they use in warships and on submarines, their sounds are so big or so loud that they can damage a whale's ability or a dolphin's ability to be able to communicate and be able to find food. And they use even more powerful ones to find oil reserves at the bottom of the sea. They use these massive, they're basically cannons that they set off. And again, he's kind of, because he's saying, he's kind of getting you emotionally involved. He's thinking about, think about what this sound would do to your mind, to your head, if you're used to using sound at the most delicate level, and all of a sudden this cannon is going off this, and sound is a physical thing that carries through water. Water magnifies the effect of sound. So, and that's, I think, when people do that kind of stuff, and communicate that well, that has an effect that just stating the fact doesn't. So if you look at people like, I don't know, Carl Sagan, or I don't know, there's loads, David Attenborough, there are loads of people who find ways to communicate the facts through ways that are incredibly emotionally engaging, and they have a big effect. So I think that's what you try and do when you're writing creative nonfiction.
But even there, I mean, like for a second, I momentarily forgot this is meant to be a children's writing podcast, and it became a whale podcast for a couple of minutes there. But that's because of the engaging way that you presented that fact. Like just saying, like you said, that a sperm whale sees using sonar waves or whatever it is, but then saying, well, actually they see through like an ultrasound. Like that is a much more engaging way. And I think that's the thing. So for our aspiring writers out there who are listening and going, hey, this creative nonfiction thing seems interesting. I might start thinking about trying to write in this way as opposed to a genre, because it's a way of writing nonfiction, really. What's the process for you when you were writing the Small Hopeful Guide to Climate Change versus all the fiction books that you've written? Like, how do you approach that differently?
Yeah, I mean, this was my first nonfiction book, and now I had worked in advertising for a while, and it may sound like that's not particularly good grounding for writing nonfiction, but I worked for 3 years as a copywriter, 3.5 years or so, and I had to learn to research different areas of the businesses that we work for. Now, we did a lot of what was called business, would have been called considered business to business advertising. So you're not doing a lot of consumer stuff, like we did some like kind of video rental or these kind of things, but a lot of it was, say, an engineering company pitching to its clients, or would be one time I had to learn about actuaries and what they did, because we were working for an actuarial recruitment company. So I had to go off and learn about these subjects and be able to find compelling ways to write about them, which actually turned out to be pretty good training, both for writing nonfiction and for fiction. So that was kind of a good grounding, because it made me, I had to go off and learn about subjects I didn't know anything about and wasn't particularly interested in. And I had to find the interesting things so I could present these to people in a way that they would appeal. That's part of the process. If you're not somebody, say, for instance, who's an expert on a subject and you're writing a textbook on it, if you're writing about a subject and your aim is to engage people who haven't been interested in this before, or are finding, that's an introduction for them. So you're looking for the interesting things in the same way that, when you're teaching, you don't always teach the most important thing first, or you don't teach in a logical way, because you might need them on board first before they'll listen to you, or they'll take it in. And I think that's it's a little bit like the headline in advertising. The thing, you want the attention grabber first before you go.
It's like one thing I always do when I'm teaching Irish to a class I haven't taught before, is one of the first lessons I teach them is, there's no such word as yes or no in Irish. And they all go, yeah, there is, Tá Neil. Like, nah. And they're like, Shani hat. I'm like, no. And and straight away they're engaged and they're listening, and they're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And that's what you're basically saying with the copywriting and with this is you need to figure out the way to hook people first. And then you also need to know what you're talking about.
Well, that's the thing, and I mean, one of the things, like I wrote a book on climate change without having any expertise on climate change, but I have read a lot about it, and I'm only kind of really passing on the work of experts, but I'm kind of summarizing and acting like the tour guide. Like, I didn't build the cathedral, but I can show people around, So, and what I was doing in writing that book was I had to cover all the basics, and I didn't want it to be overly negative, because it's extremely easy to just go completely negative with it. There's a lot of bad news, obviously, and it's getting worse. But I also wanted I wanted there to be a momentum and a sense of momentum, so that people feel like, that they're, particularly for young people, that they're not just starting now. This is something that has been happening for a long time, and people have been acting on it for a long time. So it's not like they're just getting on a train that's starting off. They're getting on a moving train. There have been people doing incredible things for a long time. There is an awful lot of, and I wanted to feel like there was a sense of progress that was kind of, well, not so much inevitable, but it was ongoing. And that there was an awful lot of stuff that we had done that was good for society, and that we had advanced, and that the part of that advance was naturally leading us away from the things that have created this mess. But I also, for each element of the topic, of the subject, I wanted to have interesting things to say that would be kind of, that's interesting, that kind of thing. So, and there, I mean, that's the thing, is that it's full of interesting things. I mean, if you were, take for instance, just our atmosphere. If you were to think about our atmosphere, we look up, it kind of feels endless, but actually, our breathable atmosphere is only about 8 kilometers deep. After that, you need oxygen if you're going to climb or fly any higher. So if you were to look at a globe and say, right, how deep is our atmosphere on that globe? You know, just the type you'd have in a classroom. Really, our atmosphere is probably about as thick as the layer of varnish around the outside of that globe, right? So if you had like the International Space Station on that globe, it would only be a few millimeters above the surface of it. You know, we tend to think it's kind of out here. No, it's like it's barely above the surface of that globe. That's how thin our atmosphere is. And now there, when you start thinking, well, actually, that's pretty limited. You know, we used to think, well, how could we affect our atmosphere? It's so big.
Yeah, because when you look up as a person up in the sky, it's endless.
It's things like that. When you start thinking about, or if I was to say to you, like, you know, where does a tree get its material from? Where does the wood come from? And most of you might kind of inclined to think that, well, it draws it up from the ground. That's where the nutrients come from. But of course, it doesn't. It gets it from the air. So 40% of a tree's weight is carbon. Or thereabouts, and that carbon came from carbon dioxide in the air. So carbon is a very solid, heavy thing when you gather it together. But so you're kind of using these kind of physical examples of things that we think of as familiar, and you think about, bloody hell, that's like, think of the oldest, biggest kind of oak tree that you know, and most of that came from the air that tree basically inhaled. So so it's trying to find these interesting things and use those to hook you in so you can give some of the other stuff, you know, just hold their attention long enough.
And then, because one thing I noticed a lot now, I haven't had the joy yet to look at or get my hands on your climate change book, but knowing of other, especially in my teaching life, knowing of other books that are in this same genre of creative nonfiction, a lot of them have a really interesting relationship between illustration and text. Like we were saying earlier, the kind of the nonfiction books most people would think of when we say I write nonfiction for kids are the kind of big white hardback books, and you open it up and there is a beautiful illustration, but it's like illustration and text surrounding it or whatever. But creative nonfiction is seeming to blur the line between illustration and text.
Yeah, I mean, there was two reasons we didn't go that route. First of all, it's a lot more expensive to produce. And it can communicate more clearly if you got lots of pictures and lots of diagrams. But also you would tend not to read it as a story if you just sat down and you had to kind of, you know, open this big kind of coffee table book. And I know, like, you know, both my kids are keen readers, but they don't tend to read those types of books from cover to cover. They'll dip into them and look at them and find an interesting picture. And I was wary of that. So I did want something that was going to be small and you kind of pick it up and maybe read from, you know, I wanted you to read from start to finish. I wanted to have a narrative arc and a clear beginning, middle, and end, so that you have a sense of progress through the book. And I also wanted to use cartoons rather than kind of straight illustrations. So I kind of see if I can find some examples. So I don't know if that's going to show up in the. So I just want kind of really simple cartoons, you know, and also where I wanted them to be kind of joking. Now a lot of them are kind of dad jokes, you know, they're kind of a bit corny, but I wanted to be disarming. So
well, I mean, you're a dad.
Yes, that's my job. But I wanted to be disarming. I wanted to feel like, you know, don't worry, this isn't, you know, I'm not trying to be too serious here. Even though you're talking about kind of like a deadly serious subject. So I wanted to have as many of those little ones as possible. And to be honest, I could have squeezed more in if I could. But the idea was that the whole book felt that, you know, like not comforting, but less threatening than a lot of the communication is about climate change. And I think you have to, when you're communicating, you have to think about your audience. You communicate different ways with different audiences. So for people who are just starting off in the subject, or young people who want to learn about it for the first time, I wanted something that was going to be the thin end of the wedge, that was going to be not too heavy, as informative as possible, as engaging as possible, and would offer hope, and would offer kind of, you know, that there are reasons to kind of, there are lots of things that we can still do. And you kind of, you're trying, at the same time, you're still trying to strike the balance to show how serious this situation is. But you also need people to feel like there's still something we can do. You don't want them to feel overwhelmed. And that's something that happens with climate change all the time, is people they'll take an interest, or they'll try to avoid the subject at first, take an interest. And then as soon as they learn too much about it, they go, whoa, that's like too much. I can't do anything. So they go straight from being kind of not caring enough to being caring so much they feel overwhelmed, thinking there's too much, and they're never going to be able to do anything about it. So it was trying to catch them in the middle, before they go too far one the other way. And I think there's a real need for that, in that, people just want to learn the basics and get their heads around it without, basically feel like they're being thrown into an abyss.
I was going to say, because that, and you've answered it already, and that's why I didn't ask it specifically, but that was one thing I was really interested in finding out, was how do you tackle a serious topic when it's a book for children? But you just said it there. It's like, give it to them in a hopeful way, and pin in the wedge, and you just need to kind of approach it softly, gently, and hoping that you're lighting the fire that will inspire them to continue to learn about it as they get older and as they're more capable of hearing.
And I wanted to kind of so towards the end of the book, there's a section on other things that we've done on a global scale, and things we're doing more and more things on a global scale. And if you think about, really, this is for the first time we're thinking as a species for the good of our planet, and that's a big thing to get your head around. And an awful lot of people still aren't there, but an increasing number of us are, in that terms of we have to think about literally everyone in the world and how this is affecting them, and we have to think about our effect on the planet, because we have become that powerful now. We have to start taking responsibility for what we've done and what we can still do. So I give a load of different examples of different things that we've done where we looked at the big picture and we did something on a big picture scale. And it could be anything from the moon landing to the millennium bug to even kind of responding to the thinning of the ozone layer. So there've been a load of those things where we've dealt with things. There's a sense that I think probably that would have helped inform our opinions on this kind of stuff, where we realize that the acts of a few people could have a major effect on the rest of the world's population. And so at the same time, you're talking about these subjects, but you still have to kind of have a levity to it that will keep people reading and making sure this is bad, but we can look at this. And actually, we've done some really incredible things, but we have to stop storing this. So it's kind of making sure the balance is always there. You don't want to kind of scare off your reader.
Oisín, this is great, but we're already coming near time. So I have this is funny. I'm recording these out of the order they're actually going to be airing. And so for my listeners and for yourself as well, these questions are going to be new, but these are a set amount of questions I'm going to ask every guest on every episode. So my first one is, when you started your illustration and author career, what's the one thing that you just wish someone told you? Like, what's the one really easy thing to fix, or easy lesson to learn that you wish you had learned quicker?
Oh, that's hard. As an illustrator, I would say charge by the hour. Learn how to charge, because it's a very intangible thing, and people, particularly artists, can be shy about how much they're worth, how much their skills are worth. And in writing too, but in writing, I think writing is very much kind of whereas illustration can be more of a trade, writing is still very much you're pitching stuff and you're taking a risk with a lot of spending a lot of time working on one project on a book. So you have to write what you love. You have to write what you take on holiday to read, so that you'll keep doing it, and you'll continue to do it until you get paid for it. And then even beyond that, you'll continue to do it after you've kind of got bitter and cynical about the publishing business. So I would always say, write what you love, and I have a lot of different types of interests, and I tend to get distracted away from things and end up taking on projects I never thought I'd do. But that's actually become part of it now. So I've ended up with books on a really wide range of stuff, which means a publisher doesn't always know what to do with you, but at the same time, I've always been interested in what I'm doing. And it's kind of led me on a path I didn't really expect, and certainly don't know how I got here in ways, but I've followed my interests, and it's always kind of kept me stimulated. So I would say that's the first thing is do it, write what you love, and learn to charge for it.
That's a really nice little simple thing, but it's very complicated at the same time. My next one then, name a book that you wish you had written or you wish you had been the illustrator for.
Oh, that's very tough.
I ask very tough questions.
Yeah. I mean, Watchmen, I think, is one of the most extraordinary works I've ever read by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. I part of me wishes I could illustrate a version of Lord of the Rings. And part of me thinks it's been done so well by other people. You kind of think you'd just be kind of, you'd be doing something again. So it's very hard to say.
No, I think
I don't tend to when I read somebody else's book, I don't have that thing where I wish I'd written that. I do have the thing where, my God, could I ever have written that? Or, sometimes read a book and the guy was like 22 and you're going, I couldn't write this now, or I don't know, there's just so many things. Or you see somebody drawing something and she's like, what's she doing? She's not even out of college and she paints better than I do. So they get that a lot, particularly on online. If you're following artists, you just keep coming across people who go, wow. But I don't think there's I don't have that thing where I wish I'd read it. I don't have a possessive thing about it. I don't wish it was mine.
So in other words, you're not like me. I'm jealous and bitter, and when I read something, I'm like, why didn't I think of that first?
No, actually, no. I can have one of the things I'm glad of is that I don't get jealous about things. I know people who do. It must be a terrible burden to bear.
Yes, it is. If you had to choose between one of these three things, what would it be? Reading, writing, and in your case, illustrating.
You see, they're only kind of separate things outside of my head. So in my head, they all kind of come together. I honestly don't know. I mean, reading is an input thing as opposed to writing and illustrating. Obviously, you're putting it out there. So ideally, I would like to film things straight out of my brain. That would, like, if I could just make a film and just kind of do the whole lot together. But for me, writing and illustrating, I mean, I worked as an illustrator. That was my job, and that was very much a trade. And I still tend to do it kind of office hours, whereas writing, I'll do, it's still a little bit of a treat to write for a living. But I couldn't really separate them out. When I grew, as I was growing up, they were the same thing for me. I was just communicating through words and pictures, and what I couldn't do with words, I'd do with pictures. But it was the same thing coming out of my brain. It was just, I had to separate it once it came out. So it'd be very hard to choose one or the other.
That's absolutely fair. Oisín, thanks so much for coming onto the show. If you could just let people know if they want to find you online, like Twitter or Instagram or website or anything like that.
Just follow my name. I don't use any other kind of titles, so just Oisín McGann, whether it's on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or just on my website, oisínmcgann.com. I don't have any other identities. You'll find me wherever you look.
That's excellent. And of course, for our listeners, there'll be links in the description or show notes or wherever you're listening to this. Oisín, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Conor. Cheers now. Goodbye.
Thanks so much to Oisín for coming onto the show. I think you'll agree it was a really enlightening interview, and I learned a lot from talking with Oisín. If you're going to take anything from this interview, I think it should be how important engagement is in your writing. Whether you're writing non-fiction or fiction, it's really important that your reader cares about what you have to say. As I said to Oisín, people always remember how you made them feel quicker than what you were trying to say. Be sure to check out the show notes on your podcasting app or wherever you're listening to this, so you can find links to Oisín's website, his books, and more. Tune in next Monday, where I'll be talking all about picture books. What is the definition of a picture book? How can you get involved in the picture book creation process? Where can you get your picture book inspiration? All will be revealed. See you then. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this as useful, as inspiring as I did. Don't forget that WonderFest is happening from the 17th to the 21st of November 2021. Head over to wonderfest.ie to find out how else you can have a whale of a time. See you there!